Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to make a start on the second of the three of this year's lectures of the UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources. I'm Paul Eakins, I'm Director of the Institute and Professor here. And we've got a real feast of knowledge, information, I hope even some wisdom for you tonight. The title of tonight's lecture couldn't be more appropriate for the ISR, because we tend to think about policy, we tend to think about resources, and we tend to think about sustainability, which obviously future generations get. Quite unusually, we've actually got a cast of three for you this evening. We've got our main lecturer, Edmund Nicholas, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute. After he's given his talk, we've got a brief discussant from Professor Dan Osborne, who for many years was working at the Natural Environment Research Council. And then, purely opportunistically, I noticed that Tom Butler had registered to come here. Tom Butler is Chief Executive Officer of the International Council of Metals and Mining, which is the premier industry organisation in this area. So I thought, well, it would be really nice if he gives a few reflections on what he's just heard. So he's been pitched in really cold. Thank you very much. So that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce Edmund. As you can see from there, he's formerly Executive Secretary of the Geological Society of London. I guess Executive Secretary means effectively CEO. So he ran that for many years. I came across him at a meeting of the UNEP's International Resource Panel, of which I'm a member. And he showed me a publication which he'd recently produced called Resourcing Future Generations. So you can imagine when I heard that, I snapped him up for one of our lectures, and I'm really very excited to hear what he's got to say. So, Edmund.
Thank you. If anybody can't hear me, you better say. As you've heard, I'm Edmund Nicholas. I was the Executive Secretary, the CEO of the Geological Society of London until last September. The Society is the oldest national geological society in the world, founded in 1807. Thankfully, I've not been there since the beginning. The views that I am going to express this evening are mine. They are not those of the Society. The Society is an adhering body to the International Union of Geological Sciences. That is how I got into chairing the New Activities Strategic Implementation Committee, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, it doesn't work. It does. It's okay.
Oh, you've got it. It's got it. That one, I imagine.
Yes. No. So, what I'm going to give you is some background, which will explain why I think that there is an issue. Tell you a little bit about IUGS, the recommendations from a workshop which took place in Namibia in July of last year, and then begin to discuss where we go from here. The very fact that we are here this evening and talking about this particular issue, I think, is of itself important. So the context to all of this, I'm sure, is very well aware to you. The last 40 years have seen a vast improvement of living standards of much of the world's poorest. But increasingly we're using a lot of metals and minerals in our technology, in our infrastructure. And the question is basically, how do you continue to be able to live doing all of that with world population which is forecast to grow to 9 billion? And the point I want to emphasize is that access to primary mineral resources is necessary both for the developed and developing countries, and particularly for those countries building infrastructure. Much as we may regret it, mineral deposits are irregularly distributed and their value has to be assessed in terms of competing use of land. So I want to begin by looking at issues of supply and demand and say something which is really self-evident, but is often overlooked. What we do not grow, fish or farm, comes out of the earth, with very few exceptions. We take a few things from the atmosphere. I'd like to introduce this with a historical view of mining. Agricola published De Re Metallica in 1556. It's a seminal work in terms of mining, refining in Europe. It was the text for almost 200 years. It's copiously illustrated with woodcuts. It shows, if you like, an artisanal view of mining, and the fact is, it's small scale. But the mining which was taking place in Germany at that time, and the lead that they had in this area, was the envy of very many other European nations. In comparison with that small-scale mining of the 16th century, mining is huge. On the left here you can see a working which is open cast mining of brown coal, of lignite. The digger here weighs something approaching 34,000 tons and is capable of moving 300 cubic meters of material a day. On the right there is Bingham Canyon in Utah, a very large copper deposit which is 4 kilometers wide, 1.2 kilometers deep, and it covers more than 770 hectares. And it's only going in one direction. It's going deeper and it's getting bigger. Sometime about the turn of the millennium, humankind became the principal agent of moving material on the planet. We now move more material annually than the carrying capacity of all the world's rivers, which is in itself rather startling. We burrow away underground and we make tunnels for mass transit. And the image on the right is also quite illustrative of what is going on. This is a sand barge carrying dredged sand from the Mekong Delta. It's probably carrying in the order of about 100 tons. They pass in a stream about 1 a minute in order to take that material to Ho Chi Minh City for construction. This is an attempt just to show how the world has changed. Life was a lot simpler when man took flint out of the chalk and worked it locally, and if he didn't have flint, he used obsidian. We now use and are quite happy, apparently, with using 30 different metals in our cell phone. And I think that the attempt here is just to show how our reliance on metals, minerals has changed through time. And again, the trajectory is only in one direction. The scale to the left is logarithmic. And here's just a selection of materials. And the demand is rising, and it's rising inexorably. And whatever it is, we're consuming more of it. I want to spend a little bit of time looking at copper, but I could equally look at iron or a number of other things which are used in large infrastructure projects. We'll come back to this figure later, There is an update of it. But here, it talks about the growth in the demand, the use of copper. It talks about a shortfall in about 2050, if in fact the demand trajectory continues to follow the historical growth. And the question which we have to ask in all of this is, even with contribution from recycling, how long will we need to depend on vast amounts of primary copper, as of other minerals? This is some work done by Klein, and I should say that all of these figures are referenced where I can, and you can look at them in more detail in the report of the workshop, which I'll come back to. To the left of this diagram is the use of various materials in what you could call current technologies. To the right are some estimates of what will be needed in terms of new energy generation and transmission technologies. And there are some startling increases of estimates of demand. There's a lot to take in there. But the message is clear. More and more of more varied materials. And if you look at these sorts of graphs, there is little sign of any slowdown in demand. If we just compare, for example, 1970 with 2010, there is a very, very dramatic change over what is only 2 generations. And increasingly, that demand is coming from Asia Pacific, which now, as a grouping, outstrips the demand of the rest of the world. That is 53%. And you can see here graphically, China, India, the developing economies compared with those that are reasonably developed. Korea, Japan, Australia. So some key trends in terms of resource demand are increase in absolute amounts, doubling or possibly tripling by 2050, increased share of demand from Asia Pacific, and if you think about the consequences of the Paris Accord, the COP21 agreement, in terms of new energy generation and transmission technologies, what effect is that going to have? And we could throw another sort of thought into all of this. What will the demand be in terms of the urbanization of Africa? But I think the point to stress is that societal awareness of their consumption of metals and minerals and the relationship with the extractive sector is almost non-existent. I don't think people generally appreciate that if they brush their teeth in the morning, the abrasive in the toothpaste is limestone dust. They don't make the connection. So where do metals and minerals occur? And I want to come now to thinking about continuity of supply. As I said earlier, minerals occur where the geology dictates. We may not like it, but that's a fact. This is a rather busy slide, Don't worry about the color coding here, but it's dealing with 12 or 14 metals. The only point to make is that they are irregularly distributed geological control. Coming back to copper and emphasizing the point. Copper occurs as veins, it occurs in sediments, but it mainly occurs in terms of production in what are called porphyries. And one mine in northern Chile produces 20% of the world's copper. The question might be, when that's exhausted, where's the next porphyry? But by understanding the geology, we want to begin to have an idea about where those deposits might be. And a byproduct from the working of the porphyries is to produce molybdenum and a range of other materials. So the geology determines the location of deposits, but mining is going deeper. And this slide relates just to base metals. Gold and diamonds were worked at depth for a long, long time. But if you just look, you can see the depth of cover. That is 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters. Increasingly, deposits are being taken from deeper in the ground, from those very large holes. And there's a profound energy implication in all of that. But it also suggests that we have already found the most easily accessible deposits. And increasingly, you're going to have to go deeper in that search. And you're probably going to have to look in countries where it's not the most conducive in terms of mining. And in order to discover some of these very deep deposits, there will be a need for new exploration tools, particularly geophysical tools, and vast amounts of data in order to have some better understanding of where those prospects are. So as we've already said, mines are getting bigger. But all grades are declining. The porphyry copper deposits range in terms of grade from 0.2 to about 1% copper. You're moving a large amount of material in order to find a small amount of copper. And that trend is not going to change. It's going to get worse. Now, there is no absolute shortage of anything. We know the crustal abundances, providing you're prepared to use the energy to take it out of the crust or take it out of seawater. So there's no absolute shortage, but I'm not sure in the energy-constrained world that we have, with the implication in terms of reducing CO2, that we can necessarily spend all the energy as we might have to and rather wastefully. And just to add to the woes, and I do promise to stop in a moment, the discovery rate is falling and the exploration costs are rising. And the red line here is simply a projection trying to make some allowance for the junior companies which historically don't systematically report their results. So there is some sort of adjustment. Nevertheless, the trend here in terms of cost and exploration rates, I think, is self-evident. Let's just take a moment about developing a mine. That's constrained by a number of factors. The geology, the geography, and government and society. And from discovery of a deposit to opening a mine may take 20 or more years. The mine expectancy, the life expectancy of that mine may be 80 to 120 years. And the cost runs into billions of pounds. There's permission to work a new potash deposit in North Yorkshire. The estimated cost of doing that is £3 billion. This is not a trivial amount of money. So it's hardly surprising in all of this that mining companies want certain security in terms of where they put their shareholders' money. And not all countries are equally open to mining and the winning of materials. And that's influenced by, for example, what you may think are rather trivial things, the presence or absence of cadastral surveys, whether or not there is basic geological information, which is helpful in terms of pre-competitiveness, whether there's no modern mining law, whether there's stable government. And so it goes on. So when I talk to colleagues, for example, in Vale, of the 200 countries in the world, possibly less than 60 are actually open to mining in the sense of being reasonably secure in terms of those large-scale investments. So here's a slide which some of you who were here at the previous lecture will have already seen. A period of exploration, a period of site design, a long period, and then of course the legacy of a mine may well be with us for a long time, depending on closure, possible pollution and collapse. Which sort of brings me to social license. And I accept I'm being rather parochial. But the attitude of the population here, I think, is shared elsewhere. So there's the compatibility, for example, of limestone mining in areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks. And there are two examples here. And then we get somewhat conflicted, because if we go to Cornwall and Poldark, we view the headgear here as being somewhat romantic. And again, I would suggest to you there's somewhat of a dissociation between this sort of landscape, the mining that did go on, and how, at least for part of the time, Cornwall was the world primary producer of tin. But where populations are sympathetic to mining, they will actually move. So in northern Sweden, Kiruna, the town itself is being relocated in order that the deposit there, which is the largest iron ore mine in the world, can continue to be worked. And in Westphalia, it's uncommon for towns to be relocated in order to allow the continued production of brown iron. Nevertheless, there is increase of conflict in land use. And although I could say to you that mining is a temporary use of land, most populations will not regard it quite in that way. So there is protest. At least one of these images actually poses a choice, farming or mining. But basically, people do not want mining in their backyard. So the key trends in resource supply: decrease in all grades, deeper mines, increased emissions, increased waste, energy and water consumption increases, operational costs go up, increasing environmental impact, and also increasing competition with other land uses, community conflict, and so it goes on. And in many jurisdictions, the whole business of obtaining license permitting can add very, very significant delay and loss of production. So what are the options? If the trends are increasing demand, and there are difficulties in supply, how do you fill the gap? What's the role of recycling, resource efficiency, public education? I showed you this in a coloured version. This is as yet unpublished, but again we've come back to copper. You can read this as well as I can, but the point at the end is that here we've got the historic production of copper. We have a projection. This is the point where recycling might have a significant contribution, rather than about 2035, which I showed you on the other diagram. This is now at 2055. Now you can accept or not some of the thoughts behind all of this, but that utopia perhaps of significant contribution, and therefore a drop in private production, I think is going out into the future rather than coming in to the near term. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the United Nations Environment Programme. Paul referred to it very briefly in mentioning the International Resource Panel, which comes under it. And you can see within the 7 topics which it covers is one which is resource efficiency, sustainable consumption, and production. This will kick in a moment, and I will stop talking for about 5 minutes whilst this YouTube presentation plays.
Natural resources are the price of modern life, and the Asia Pacific spends more than the rest of the world combined. Resource efficiency in Asia has the potential to double or even triple. We can get more from less, but how can we recognize the opportunities? The United Nations Environment Programme, the CSIRO of Sydney University, have collected 118 resource use indicators for 26 countries in the region for the last 40 years. That's how we know that the region as a whole is extracting over 2,000 trillion litres of water per year. This is the rate we extract water in the Asia-Pacific region all day, every day. That's equivalent to 27 Olympic swimming pools every second. And this is the amount of metal used in the region every single day. That's over 100 tons every second. We have over 100 metrics, which means that we know precisely what it takes to build our economies across the region, including the greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere, which is currently equivalent to 600 tons of carbon dioxide every second, all day, every day. That's about half the global total. Measuring resources can tell us more than just how much we consume as a region. Indicators reveal opportunities. economic and environmental opportunities. For example, how much water do we need to extract to keep the economy going? This is measured by how much water we use to generate each dollar of GDP. Here in Thailand, for example, it is this much.
Looking at economies this way raises questions. Why should the water needed for each dollar in Pakistan be so much greater than in Papua New Guinea? How does the economy of Japan manage with so little water use? These questions wouldn't even arise without resource indicators, but the answers can provide the basis for sound environmental and development policies.
What about other resources? What does it take to generate $1 in the Asia Pacific? The resource indicators show a big difference between industrial and developing countries. On average, in developing countries in the region, every dollar of GDP needs this much resource use. This much biomass, represented here by rice, fossil fuels, represented by this coal, metal and construction materials. This is what it takes to earn $1 in developing economies. It may not seem like very much, but multiply that by the GDP of developing countries, which is $6.5 trillion. Now that's a lot of rice.
Add it all up, and this is the quantity of resources that powers the economies of developing countries in the region every day.
The use of materials in the industrialized countries in the region is very different. Earning $1 in industrialized countries takes less than 1/10 of the materials.
For historical and structural reasons, industrialized countries squeeze a lot more value from the resources they use. Resource indicators give us new insights into economic development and the environment. As economies develop, the demand for resources will increase. There are huge variations across the region, which means there are opportunities for significant improvement. And this is how much industrialized and developing countries consumed every day in 1990. Over 20 years, it has changed a lot. We can see the growth in consumption, much of it in China, and consumption continues to grow, which means it is increasingly important to understand how resources are used. Resource indicators raise questions and provide answers. By engaging with data in this way, we can identify economic and environmental benefits across the whole region.
I thought that was interesting in introducing a number of ideas, and in particular in terms of public communication. So what else is going on? The International Union of Geological Sciences is one of 31 unions within what is called the International Council for Science. It's a scientific union of earth scientists. It's basically a collection of academics. But the point about it is advances of knowledge and understanding in the science space find practical application. So one of the activities begun in 2013 is somewhat cumbersome title, New Activities Strategic Implementation Committee, which I chair. And there is a particular initiative, Resourcing Future Generations. Now, as originally envisaged, this was going to look at raw materials, energy, and water. It's currently focused on raw materials. When we went out and we consulted with industry about what we had in mind to do, they said, you lack focus, do less, and provide something which is doable within 2 years. Well, we sort of took that on board, but nevertheless, the raw materials side is not soluble within 2 years. So we've consulted with industry, published papers, organised a symposium in Tianjin in October 2014, and published a white paper basically on supply demand. We also had a workshop of specialists in Namibia last July. So just before I talk about the workshop and all of that, to recapitulate, metal and mineral resources have underpinned dramatic improvements of living standards. We know that world population is going to go up. Access to primary mineral resources is necessary for developed and developing countries, and mineral deposits are irregularly distributed. And their extraction is in competition with other uses of land, but potentially they have a contribution to play in the alleviation of poverty, empowering communities and nations. So what's the problem? We know the demand is up. Substitution and recycling will make improvements, but will not be enough on their own. Projections for energy technology, urbanization, and economic growth will dramatically increase demand for all raw materials. And going back to the work of Klein, which I showed you earlier, the increased demand for some is either a doubling or 100-fold increase, depending on what you choose to take. The most obvious deposits are known, they've been discovered, and we're progressively working around red deposits. And the rate of discovery is not keeping pace with exhaustion of deposits. So I would suggest to you that there is a need to forestall unpredictable yet inevitable supply shortages in decades to come. The question is how might we do that? So we went to Namibia, 17 of us. And why did we go there? Mainly because the background information, the pre-competitive information, which is available in that country, is an attraction to inward investment. So that's most of us, but not all of us. And we went on retreat for 5 days, and we thought about a number of questions. And one morning and one afternoon we went on safari. But we were fortunate enough to be able to talk to the Minister of Mines and Energy there, and also the CEO of the Chamber of Mines. We also talked to De Beers, the CEO there. And we discussed 3 themes. And you can read them as easily as I can read them out to you. Balancing resource supply and demand, mineral supply and accessing new resources, building additional capacity to facilitate responsible development in less developed nations. And the context of all of this, of course, are the Sustainable Development Goals. And very particularly Goal 8 and 12. And the target here is really rather immediate, 2030, in terms of resource efficiency and sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. So the group of 17 were not all geologists, you'll be pleased to hear, but they were economists and social scientists. It was a good mix. They came from a number of countries, from Australia, from Peru, Brazil, Northern Europe, and also America, and quite a few from Australia. So the result of our 5 days of work was some recommendations. The need for international guidelines for planetary mineral consumption, raising awareness of the impacts that you and I and what we do have in terms of mineral consumption. And it sort of introduces almost an ethical dimension, coming back momentarily to the NIMBYism. Is it ethical to export the environmental consequences of mineral extraction to another country? I'll leave you with that thought. And in order to do this, there is a need for investment and research, and particularly into exploration and extraction technologies. And the thought that we had was that it might be possible to develop global best practice for responsible mineral resource development. You could say that we are naive, but we have to start somewhere. These are some of the outputs which have come from resourcing future generations. The supply-demand white paper, the report of the workshop of last July. This is an 8-page brochure. That is a 1-page note for legislators for opinion forms. But we're a small group in the end, and there are limits to what we can do. So if, as I believe, and you agree with me, that we need to do something, how do we bring about change? We can talk within the International Council for Science, but we really need to talk to other groups, and particularly the mining industry, the World Bank, European Union, African Union, and so on. The fact of the matter is that there are very, very many players here. There's a cacophony, almost, of contribution. And what I want to suggest to you is that there needs to be some new form of social contract for mining. A contract that involves all the stakeholders. Local communities, national communities, the mining companies, but also in some way bridges between countries. And again, you could say this is a rather naive view of it. But there are actors already on the scene who make significant contribution. And here is some work, just to illustrate what is going on within the International Council on Metals and Mining. The point is that the workshops, there is good practice guidance, there are reports. So how do we begin to bring it all together? This is a slightly startling cartoon. And I suppose really what it is arguing is, does resource extraction and the legacy of colonialism keep poor countries poor? Now, I don't want to go into it, but dependency theory would argue that it does. So what can be done? The Sustainable Development Goals refer to sharing the wealth generated by mining more equitably and to the socio-cultural consequences of geological activities, including nation building and so on. But how do we go about that? And in using the word social contract, I would have in mind the work of Locke and Rousseau and others, where you come together and you agree on a cause for a broader common good. So what I hope I've done is to show you that there is an issue, that there are shortages, and to begin to put before you a question about how we meet both existing and future demand. The current lack of investment in exploration could exacerbate this going forward. Anglo-American are reducing their workforce from 150,000 to 50,000. What will be the consequences of that 10, 20 years on? Mitigation of climate change and the development of new energy generating and transmission technologies will add to demand. Coming back to countries who are prepared to support mining. Unless there is a fairer way which distributes wealth, I don't think the number of countries is going to increase much before above 60, which means that there is vast scope elsewhere. It may be an unpalatable thing to say, but if you are going to be able to sustain the present standards of living which we enjoy, but also raise those in developing countries, to my mind, as a geologist, there is only one outcome: more mining. But how can you do that in a more sustainable way? That's me. I'm done. If you want to read any more about it, you can find all this on the particular website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Edmund. Very scholarly and challenging presentation all at once, opening it up with that key question of social contract. I'm going to move straight on to our two reflectors or discussants. Dan Osborne, as I said, specialised in the links between policy and the Natural Environment Research agenda through the Natural Environment Research Council, for which he worked for many years. He's now a professor here. Do come up and give us your thoughts.
One of many challenges: minerals, energy, water, food, energy, water, etc. There are lots of these combinations. There are many factors driving the world at the minute. Edmund, you mentioned land use. That's a major factor. In terms of producing enough food for the world and its growing population, we're getting towards the point where we've got 1/4 of a hectare per head of agricultural land in about 2050 to produce all the food we need. And that's quite a challenge for everybody that doesn't live in the tropics, because of the rate of the energy from the sun coming in to fuel the biomass production. So I think the kind of thing we saw, where there's a regional appreciation of how much resource is being used to keep the world running, is a very good way of doing things, but time is short. Many of the international agreements call us to do things by 2030. In terms of new technologies, that's tomorrow or today. We need the technologies now in order to deploy them globally by 2030. And Goal 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals says we should be providing energy to people, which Edmund, you said, would need a lot of new technological development, and that's what we need to make Paris work. So for that to happen, Goal 7 alone asks by 2030 for universal access to energy, increased use of new renewables, double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency, an enhancement of international cooperation, an expansion of infrastructure, and upgrades of technologies. And a lot of those things have no associated definitions with them. What kind of upgrade? What kind of expansion of infrastructure? So there's a lot of unknowns in the international agreements, and that increases the amount of technical challenge there is. In the Paris Agreement, Paris is to work, sort of overall context of tonight's discussion in a way, there is a huge amount of technical work to be done. So I would ask Edmund, perhaps, a bit of a challenge, how does your group plan to interact with the Paris Agreement's technical committee and technical groupings, which need to report on where they're headed over the next 30 or 40 years by 2019? So all these things are saying things are extremely urgent, and we need to move now on those agreements. And why do we need to move now? Because the rate in which the climate is changing will put extra pressures on all the other pressures that we've already got. And February was the warmest year in the climate record. And it's likely that we'll find that the other months to come this year will make this year the warmest year in the climate record. So there's an urgency that seems to come through from the need to meet international agreements and the need to adapt and mitigate what's happening to the planet as a result of human activity. People are now the largest influence on a number of planetary processes. That's a game changer for the way we actually relate to our natural environment and how we think about living our lives in the future. And minerals is just one of those factors that we need to consider in this very short time scale. So how are we going to make a policy response in a timely fashion if policy responses are needed? I mean, I was thinking a little bit about this, and policymakers might say to you, Edmund, why should we believe the figures? We've heard this for oil before. What's different about minerals? Can't we just leave things to the market, to the private sector, to produce more minerals and respond if the regulatory framework is right? But the problem we face internationally is there is a trend to make government so small that it perhaps cannot perform the regulatory function that it needs to do. To be an effective regulator, it needs to have a sufficient grasp on technical matters. So where will that technical advice come from? From academia or from the private sector? That's a major kind of challenge that we've got to face. Can we replace, it will be another policy maker's question I suppose, existing minerals in the way they're used with substitutes? A lot of people say there's a big scope for substitution. Not that the products are here at the moment, so it's a bit of a wish. So this is relying on innovation. We can be hopeful that there will be some innovations, but will there be, if you like, enough? And who needs to make a policy response? Is there anything for the European Union to do, or the UK? We don't seem, from your report, to be major players in terms of the resources we would appear to have. And yet, so there are major economic blocks that might not have many levers to pull in the international debate. So that's an unexpected inequality in this, but not the quite kind of inequality that we normally talk about. We might find the EU looking at other parts of the world and really pushing quite hard for equity in this process, in some degree of fairness. But how does one economic bloc lever the other economic blocs that have got the resources? So I think there are a lot of questions there about how we forestall these inevitable supply shortages in policy terms, and how do we get the whole international policy community to act quickly. I mean, what would happen if we wanted to encourage industrial development in research and investment, etc.? How can that be encouraged? Does that mean tax breaks for the mining sector? That might not be politically popular in some of the countries which hold the greatest resources. So there are political things to be won here, as well as policy ones. If you want international guidelines, that means there needs to be some leadership in organisations like the OECD, and it looks like the Asia Pacific are leading the way. So there are a lot of challenges for international and national organisations. I think, Paul, there's so many things that I could go on about. I'll stop because it's a very interesting and challenging topic.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And you've shown your kind of research background because you've just mapped out a research agenda, which we could certainly be active on and submit applications to NERC indefinitely. So we've got lots of questions here. I'm going to look and see whether we've got any solutions from the industry, Tom. So for your reflections, please. This is Tom Butler. He's Chief Executive Officer of the International Council of Mining and Metals, or Metals and Mining. I'm not sure, is it Metals and Mining?
I don't know, actually.
In that case,
I can't.
So that's fine. With one slide, with some of the publications that that organisation produces. Tom, please.
Thank you, Paul. And, thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the debate. I'm conscious that I'm surrounded by professors, so I feel very intimidated. And thank you, Adam, for the plug on ICMM. I did not pay you for that. You touched on a lot of interesting points, and I thought I'd just pick up on a handful of them. So one interesting thing is in terms of the projected demand that you're looking at. I think, I don't know when those curves were produced, but I suspect that they don't include the pathway to low carbon, and actually there are a number of studies out there which project that demand for metals will be even higher. There's one study which said that if we go to a completely renewable economy by 2050, the demand for metals could in aggregate be as much as 18% per annum more than we're currently projecting. So it could be even scarier. You touched on societal awareness, and I think you're right that it is very low, especially in the developed world. When I started this job, which was about 9 months ago, I went around and met all the CEOs of the different members that I have. I had 23 members, and I always remember the anecdote that was told to me by Andrew Mackenzie, who's the head of BHP, one of the bigger mining companies, who was telling me about how his daughter went up to Oxford, and on her first day, she was exchanging notes with her roommate about what their fathers did, and her roommate, who was going to Oxford, so presumably reasonably aware, said to her, "Oh, your dad does mining. Do we still mine?" And this I think was a bit of a wake-up call for Andrew Mackenzie. So this is something that ICMM really spends a lot of time and effort on, and we'll be putting more effort on that in the future. Social license is, of course, the other issue. A lot of communities would like to benefit from mining, but almost nobody wants a mine in their backyard, and that applies, both to the developed world and also the developing world. And although I'm happy to say that the UK has approved its first new mine and built its first new mine in 45 years in Devonshire last year, so we have actually managed to do it, and I think it was in a national park. Or
it's just outside, talking about heaven.
In Devon. But it's also something that we do a lot of work on, and I think one of the issues to do with social license is that the local communities, the communities who are the most impacted, especially in developing countries, don't feel that they certainly understand they're going to be impacted, but they don't often feel that they're going to benefit or that they can trust the government and the mining company to make sure that they benefit. One of the reasons for that is that most countries don't have formal structures for transferring some of the taxes and payments from national government to regional government, and then the other reason is that often the regional governments don't have capacity, or they're corrupt, and even if they do receive extra benefits from a mine, there's a risk of those benefits being captured and appropriated by elites. So one of the messages that I constantly pass to governments actually is that if you want to make your investments more stable, you need to work on this. And a classic example is Peru, where there are something like $25 billion worth of mines which are either on hold or abandoned. Mining companies don't like to admit they've abandoned them, so they're on hold, but effectively they're stalled because of social pressure. And some of that social pressure is because the although there is a mechanism in Peru for royalties to flow to municipalities, often the money sits in an escrow account or gets misspent, so the communities don't actually feel that they're benefiting. And then you talked also about fairness and equity, and that's an ongoing challenge as well, and it comes back again to the distribution of benefits between the private sector, the region that's impacted, and the national government. So you asked us for answers. Well, one of the recommendations was develop global best practice, and of course that's what ICMM has tried to do, and we've come up, in fact, we have what we call a sustainable development framework, which is a set of principles which all our members sign up to and report on every year. And we hope that through demonstrating that we're doing the right thing, we're leading by example, then that the rest of the industry will pick up on it. I think there's been some success on some of the policies we put out, but perhaps not all, and perhaps not across the whole industry. We also think that a lot more can be done about recycling and resource efficiency. So on the resource efficiency, I think the contribution the industry can make is really about making our own industry more efficient, so getting the minerals out of the ground whilst using less energy and more efficiently, and also while using, to the extent possible, renewable energy. So we've been, I think the snowball is starting to roll on that amongst our members. We've got something like 200 megawatts so far of renewable energy, which is a very small number in the global context, but if you go back 10 years ago, it was 0. And I was very pleased to see that Goldfields is about to contract a 40 megawatt solar plant in Johannesburg, which would be a first in Africa for a mining company. So, small numbers, but I'm told that the cost of solar power is going down 20% every 2 years. So hopefully this will turn into a bigger number. And then the other area is recycling, and there's a number of points to make which I think are lined up with what you said. So first of all, I think the mining industry is very bad about understanding how its materials are used and where they're used. And in answer to the point you made about leaving it to the market, I don't think we should leave it entirely to the market. I think the policymakers can make a big contribution in terms of understanding where these products go and how we can be more efficient about using them. And there are some examples which I think are quite innovative within the industry. So for example, Teck, which is one of my members, a Canadian company, has discovered that they can recycle fluorescent lights in one of their smelters and recover a lot of metals from the fluorescent lights. Umicore, which is not a member, a Belgian company focused on the downstream part of the industry, has discovered that it can be profitable to lease some of the high-value alloys that they produce. So they actually, they will lease metals to a company like Rolls-Royce, who will put it in a jet engine, and then 10 years later, obviously they're getting lease payments, but 10 years later, when the lease is due, they actually recover the metal. So that is a market-based way of being a lot more efficient about how you recover alloys which are quite valuable. Ellen MacArthur has talked a lot about redesigning end products so that we're more efficient about what we use, and she's very fond of talking about how the most profitable factory in Renault's stable is actually the factory that reconditions car engines. So the factory that makes the most money is not the factory making new cars, but the factory buying car engines from all the other car makers and reconditioning them and putting them into new cars. So a few small examples of what can be done. I think there's a lot more to be done, and I think in order to do that you need to have a much better understanding of the product systems. And then I'm almost done, but I also think we should we need a lot better data to inform the correct policy decisions, which is another reason not to leave it to the market. I mean, there are some examples in this country, not necessarily to do with mining, but if you look at the 5p tax on plastic bag, it reduced consumption of plastic bags by 80%. If you look at the tax incentives for using diesel, that's resulted in a very significant unintended consequence, which is that we've got probably the most polluted street in Europe just down the road in terms of particulates. And then finally, I fully agree with the need for collaboration to get this data out to, there's lots of actors, there is a cacophony, but I think through collaboration we can hopefully generate some order out of the chaos. So I'll maybe stop there and we can open it up for what will no doubt be an interesting debate.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom. I think that's great. That's great. I'm just going to have a quick commercial break, really, just to emphasise the kinds of things that we do. You mentioned BHP Bulletin. BHP Bulletin, of course, is our founding corporate partner. So we know Andrew Mackenzie really well. And been very impressed that as a company, it's the first company that does fossil fuels and other mining that has published a strategy for itself that is consistent with the 2-degree world. So we very much hope other fossil fuel mining companies going to go down that route. We have a PhD student who's just finishing his PhD who is looking at renewables in some of BHP Bulletin's mines and others. So working with a German company to do installation of renewables there. And of course we're one of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's pioneer universities, so we work quite closely with them too. So we're trying to do our bit on several aspects of that agenda. Now, again, enough from me. Questions to the panel. Edmund, would you like to come and take your rightful place in the middle? And we've got a question here. Depends, we've got a question there. I'll take a couple to start with, so if you'd like to make a few notes as the question comes, and then we'll see who is best placed to answer. The gentleman here, please tell us who you are, and then we'll get to know each other.
Okay, my name's Andrew Bloodworth. I look after research at British Geological Survey on minerals and waste, and in a former life I was mining advisor to the UK Department for International Development. Really interesting, gents, particularly Edmund. And just a couple of observations, really. One is, I've been around this topic a long time, and it was really good to hear that my thinking's pretty much aligned with your thinking. It's about the message, really, and I think the message for the world out there, which is, and we have to keep it simple, and I was really pleased to hear you say, you know, the issue isn't we're going to run out of anything, because that's what the media focus on, that's what politicians focus on, physical exhaustion. Physical exhaustion isn't really an issue for us. And I mean, how do we make that sustainability message as simple as possible? And I think one of them is, there's a resource efficiency thing, there's the recycling thing, although we have to be careful about that one because it's not a panacea. But the other one is, I think the biggest question for us, and you've all touched on it, is how do we decarbonise our metal use? That's what we need to do, more than anything else. Because that's what's going to get us. We're not going to hit the physical limits, we're going to hit the environmental limits. And it's how we do that. And I think that's a massive issue for us over the next 20, 30 years. How do we do that? Thanks. Okay, I'm going to ask the panel just to keep that. Edmund, you had quite a lot of questions from Dan here on your left, which I can ask you to address at the end. I think there was a question here.
Hello, my name is Ramon. I'm an architect and a circular economy enthusiast. And I recently read something about taxation policy, being very strong on labor and less strong on resources. And I wanted to ask if that is something that would help enormously to the agenda, climate change agenda, or if it's too simple to really change anything.
Thank you. The advocate of environmental tax reform, a man after my own heart. I've written a lot on that subject myself. We'll see what the panel has to say. Perhaps I can toss in a third question, which is to do with prices. There were some people, including the McKinsey Institute, who had a lovely graph that showed throughout the 20th century, broadly prices of commodities coming down. And from the year 2000 to the year 2010, prices of commodities going up at an enormous speed, that more than compensated for that century-long decline in prices. And so we kind of thought, well, the market might be signalling something here, and this will be a good thing. And then since 2013, of course, what goes up can come down, and it has come down dramatically. So what the hell is going on? So in the context of the talks that you were giving, so that's my little one. So Edmund, do you want to start with those questions?
Well, I mean, just to pick up the business about environmental taxation. The point I had in mind in coming along and talking was really to approach this from my understanding as a geologist. Others are far more expert in all sorts of fields, particularly in terms of policy, tax reform, and so on. I think really what I'm suggesting is there has to be far more effective discussion between the various groups. I don't think we talk to one another. And part of the difficulty is we have our own professional language, which is the refuge of, if you like, the coward. And we have to be able to have a far more adult conversation and agree really what the issues are, and try to understand what is actually practical in a policy sense in order to affect change. Now the difficulty, of course, is bringing it all together. I mean, the last thing we need is any new institutional framework. We've got far too many players here as it is. My question, back to all of you is, who will lead on this? Now, in a sense, having this conversation this evening is the beginning, potentially, of a process. But what I'm actually very sure about is that unless the discussion embraces government on the one hand, but industry on the other, we'll get absolutely nowhere. And we'll be having a very similar conversation in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. Now, part of the problem, in a sense, is people went to Paris, they signed an accord, and they did not know what they were doing. All right? There's a blank check and a half there, as though suddenly all the necessary materials to decarbonise economies, to put in place new, better energy generation technologies, is just going to happen. It won't unless you've got the materials. And some of the estimates of demand, either in terms of electricity generation and transmission, or carbon capture and storage, sequestering carbon, are horrendous. But nobody has acknowledged there could be a problem.
Okay, so you're throwing the challenge back. Dan, do you want to address any of those
issues? Things like tax. Well, I think it's all about externalities in a way, and how we account for those. But I think we're faced with something entirely new here, which is the things I've referred to already, which is the timescale over which we're supposed to achieve these things. And carbon emissions need to peak in 2020 to keep us to a 2-degree world. And as you just said, Edmund, the Paris Agreement has got a voluntary basis, which requires a lot of technical activity. We don't quite know how to get to those targets of decarbonising any industrial sector, let alone, say, the minerals one. So when we talk about taxation and prices and things like that, I wonder really whether we need a deeper way of changing how we relate people, the environment and the resources they need. Now, at the minute, we fix things constantly come up with technical fixes that create new economic and social opportunities. But we often do that without thinking about the people and the environmental issues at the start of the process. So we need to think through how we bring technologies into place, as well as how we use more traditional economic levers like taxation and price adjustments. And I think if we had a different way of thinking about things, then and a different sense of what the aims of economic and social development should be, we avoid too much inequality, which is what we're heading for at the moment, is no good for anybody. We might then have a better way in which we could bring taxes and prices in. But fortunately, I'm not an economist, so Paul has to come up with a real answer.
Well, I've come up with the answer, it's just that no one implements it. So I'm looking now at you, Tom.
All right. Well, having warned me that you're an expert on taxation, I venture to jump in. But I think so. My view on carbon certainly is that it should be priced, and I was perhaps naively hoping that there would be a bit more progress made in Paris on that. But I think it's going to come sooner rather than later. We've actually collectively as a membership called for pricing as long as it's imposed in a sort of predictable way and that there's a level playing field. You don't have pricing in one country and not the other. Whether you should tax other raw materials, I'm not sure, but maybe we should think harder about the end products that we tax. And the obvious example, for example, would be taxes on luxuries. I walk down my street and I see all these Aston Martins sitting there, and I wonder, really, whether we should be moving to a shared economy and why any of us need cars in London. On the prices, I think that, so what's happening right now is there is a lot of very confused signals from China. So that is contributing to lack of demand, and then there is significant excess supply which has been built up in the last 10 years because of the boom that we went through, and that supply, depending which commodity, there's still oversupply. But I see this as a 2 to 3 year phenomenon. It's well known for being a very cyclical industry, as has been pointed out. There's in the medium to long term, there's going to be significant demand, and we'll be back in the upturn of the cycle after perhaps 3 years, perhaps 5 years, but that's the kind of order of the period, I think.
It seems very inefficient to build all these mines, find that contributes to excess supply, and then kind of shut them down and sack a whole lot of guys, and we've heard some of those numbers, and then be forced to hire them again in 5 years' time. I kind of feel humans ought to do it a bit better, but perhaps that's what capitalism does.
It's no good for innovation.
A gentleman at the back, and then we'll take this gentleman at the front.
Adrian Jones, Earth Sciences in UCL. I have a possible suggestion for a cure coming from Campbell School of Mines, who visited here recently, and Francis Waugh presented an idea which was the equivalent of a fair trade, commodity-based additional levy on the products. In this way, the money would return closer to the source, and people who were disadvantaged by having a mine in their backyard would feel the benefit. So, although it's difficult to apply across multiple commodities and all the difficulties of irregular geological distribution, as Edmund illustrated, I feel that was quite an intelligent step forwards that people would then have the choice to back if they wished to, which would make a fairer economy for material commodities. What does the panel think about that?
That's a nice suggestion. I wrote a bit about sustainable commodity agreements as a kind of trying to encapsulate some of that idea. So we'll get that.
It was the idea of branding that she was particularly selling.
Yeah, great. Gentleman here.
Julian O'Halloran, writer and broadcaster. I'm very interested in this area where resource shortages collide absolutely directly head-on with low carbon policy. It used to be claimed and maybe still is in some quarters, that nuclear power is no carbon or low carbon. But some clever researchers worked out that you only need to double, treble, maybe quadruple the number of reactors in the world to get to a situation where the grade of uranium ore available became so low that, you know, it was costing something like 10 times the amount in money and 10 times the amount in CO2 emissions to get out of the ground. Can the panel tell us a bit more about the constraints they see at the moment when, you know, we have demand for solar panels shooting up? I think the rate of solar expansion in this country in the last 3 or 4 years was, I don't know, 8 or 9 times what had been predicted. And then again, what about wind turbines? What kind of resources constraints do you see or envisage there?
Right, we'll hold that one for a moment. PhD, one of my PhD students actually, who's working specifically on the material requirements of the energy system and is putting that into our energy system model. Lots of questions, which is great. I'm going to keep us from our refreshments a bit just to make full use of our panel. So this gentleman here, and then I'll go to the panel, and then we'll come back and have another round.
Hi, thanks. John Cowley, Mineral Resource Planning Associates. I'm a mineral developer in the UK. You talked about environmental taxes. Well, we've had an environmental tax, much like Francis Wall was talking about, which is the aggregates levy. And it didn't really change anything, basically. It's just passed on the costs to everybody through the process and just caused costs to rise for everybody. Now, it didn't really resolve the problem of what was the perceived problem, which was to compensate people in the immediate vicinity of mineral workings for a perceived environmental cost. Well, there were lots of issues about the value of what was actually put into that. And it was rather sort of rubbish at the end of the day, the whole value. And now it's been taken by government as a general taxation. And it's not being used to offset costs because basically there isn't enough harm to be offset by the value of the income that's being generated by the aggregates levy, which is now £2 a tonne, so it's quite a significant cost. But it's passed on to all of us. And I bet nobody in this room knows that every tonne of aggregate they buy has a £2 tax on it, just because there's an environmental cost somewhere. And we have, obviously, also we have the landfill tax, which is another cost that's passed on to all of us.
I certainly know about this,
yeah.
Because I recommended it.
That's a pity, because that's another cost that's passed on to all of us.
So we can discuss that in due course, but this isn't my show. So here we have some questions. Again, I mean, I think it's interesting to raise this issue of raw material taxation again, and to what extent that might help with recycling, to what extent it might provide a fund to compensate communities that did experience harm, given that that is not an unknown phenomenon. So there was that. And then there were Julian's questions about, you know, a collision between the low carbon and the other agenda. So let's take those two to start.
Can I pick up on the business of labour?
Yeah, that's the first.
I mean, we have food labour, and it's not been around very long. I don't know what effect that has in terms of purchasing.
Don't know my wife.
No, but we referred earlier to plastic bags. What I'm saying is that you can change consumer choice, reaction.
Yeah.
All right? And I think at the moment, in terms of a lot of what we do, we are completely unaware of where the stuff comes from. I go to the supermarket, I can buy asparagus at any time of the year. When I'm actually buying Peru's exported water, you don't often think of it quite in that way. So I think that there is quite a lot that can be done in terms of public awareness. Now, we ought to, I think, suggestion, be moving towards people being more responsible for their actions. And it's only by information that can be achieved. Because if you tell people that the result of making a particular purchase is an environmental consequence in a country's time, will they change? I don't know.
Well, I mean, obviously we've had fair trade, we've had
Yes,
organic,
exactly.
and so there is a whole thing, stuff on labelling, so it's, that's kind of interesting. We've had two questions on the decarbonisation issue and the kind of, you know, the imperatives of decarbonisation. I'm wondering if Dan or Tom, you know, you'd like to come in a bit on that, decarbonisation. I mean, is the, Tom, if we start with you, is the industry up to the challenge of recognising that we're going to need however many more wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, CCS, nuclear perhaps, who knows?
I mean, I think we, you know, as I said earlier, I think yeah, we recognise that the likely demand for many metals is going to go up significantly. Whether we can meet the challenge is basically, you know, the point that Edmund's been highlighting. I think you know, wind turbines use something like four tons of other materials like, you know, coal and steel and aluminium just for one you know, a single wind turbine. So it is a very significant challenge. I'm not, the uranium numbers, my gut feeling that sort of doesn't sound right to me, because I think if you look at how much energy a single nuclear plant produces, it's difficult to it's difficult to see that you would spend that much energy in getting enough uranium to run the plant. But I'm happy to be corrected on that. Just to come back to the fair trade, I mean, that has been tried by there are niche NGOs who are trying to do it with gold. Goldfields are actually trying to do it with something they're calling green gold, which they're branding as responsibly produced. What's interesting is since Amnesty International brought out a report on the use of cobalt, which targeted end users like Apple and Volkswagen. We've had Apple in our offices, and perhaps you could get Apple to say we'll only buy our cobalt from 2 or 3 mines, and perhaps they would even say we'll donate $1, you know, for every iPad we sell to go back to the communities. But there is de facto, you know, in many countries, theoretically at least, there are taxes going to communities already. The bigger challenge is distributional, and how do you distribute them fairly? It's fine for us to pay $1, you know, if we buy an iPad which goes back to the local community, but then how do you actually make sure it ends up, you know, used wisely and fairly?
Indeed. Dan, do you want to?
I wonder whether we need to think about combining instruments really one way or another. You know, what about labelling something, and then that might nudge people in one way, but if you labelled it and taxed it, you know, perhaps that would increase the incentive. Very good. Often we only use one or the other. Why don't we, in this situation where we need to change things quickly, why don't we start combining policy instruments here?
May I refer briefly to wind as a term?
Do you want to just hang on to that while I'm going to pick up the rest of the questions. I'm aware that we need to finish it, so just keep your remark, because I'm then going to ask each three of you just to sum up and bring up on that. This gentleman here is very keen to say something. Gentleman here. There's the third one there. I'm hoping we might get a woman asking a question.
Hello, I'm Mike Brooks. I'm a retired chemical engineer from Swansea University. Went to Zambia when I graduated, so I became immersed in the metallurgical world. I'm also on the Institute of Minerals and Mining. I'm on board of the Extractive Metallurgy and Mineral Processing Committee. Has anyone read Dr. David Mackay's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think in there he spells out quite clearly a lot of the options we've been talking about, and I'm very surprised that concentrated solar thermal power stations aren't springing up in the deserts. We could get our steam turbine sets that we're closing down on these coal-fired power stations and ship them out there. We've done that with acid plants to Chile and Spain. And why we talk metals? You can have mirrors, heliostats. You don't need metals necessarily to generate solar power. You can use heliostat mirrors. Mirrors are quite easy to make. We could set up glass plants next to solar power stations in the deserts. And all the job opportunities this gives all the people in these countries who are crying out for work at the moment. I do not understand why concentrated solar power is not taking off. Transmission of the power, yes, you need transmission cables, high voltage DC cables, 3% loss per 1,000 kilometers, nothing. And maybe with graphene coming along, we'll do away with copper transmission lines. We can use graphene, which apparently is 100 times more capability than copper. I'm rambling a bit, but there's so many things have come up tonight that, like Rossing, I worked at Rossing Uranium back in the 70s, and we mined 150 tons of rock to make 10 tons of uranium oxide. So this gentleman here's comment, I don't know the answer, but I'm sure that it was a very efficient process. It's still running, I mean, Rossing.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. One of the nice things about these lectures is that they do attract people with great backgrounds and expertise. Do you want to pass it to this lady at the front here? And I'll say, you will have heard that Morocco has just opened an enormous concentrated solar power. So, you know, there are solutions and there are things going on. Yes?
My name's Danny Gent. I work at the Department of Energy and Climate Change on climate finance issues. I just wanted to make a point about the Paris Agreement, in that, you know, 180 plus countries came forward with their INDCs, so their kind of country plans for how they intend to reduce emissions. And quite a lot of these plans sort of contain sector-specific actions, as it were. But at the moment, these are sort of quite high-level statements and commitments on how they're going to achieve their emission reductions. So I kind of wanted to get a sense from you of the kind of quality and how well those INDCs cover the mining and mineral extraction activities. I guess my question as well is how we now turn these kind of high-level commitments into kind of granular policies and measures at the country level. What should we be doing to support countries in their implementation of actions, particularly in relation to this sector? Thank you.
Okay, that's just a small question. How to follow up on Paris. So we're not going to get into the whole climate thing here, but the issue of the materials that we'll need for climate are obviously important. There's a gentleman there. I think I saw one more hand, and then and a gentleman at the back, and then we're going to have one more round down the front. You just bring it all up with your remarks about wind. Yeah.
Thank you. Bhavish Patel. I have like a slightly varied background. I'm working as a consultant at Commodities Research Group, and also at the Department of Chemical Engineering at Imperial College, and I also have a company looking at biomass processing. So one of the numbers that I picked up was that the demand for metals would go up perhaps by 18% per year if we were to meet a 100% renewable target. But then what I'm thinking is obviously that mining and extraction of metals goes hand in hand with the chemical industry, and there is a big drive to make the chemical industry greener. And at the same time, I think it was today or maybe past few days, IEA released some figures that for the past 2 years, for energy generation, we haven't actually emitted any extra CO2, and that is decoupled with economic growth. So what I'm thinking is, has anyone actually looked at how this feeds back into, say, mining, and what would be the implication of, for instance, is this a model for financing as well? For instance, you mentioned also that for jet engines you have a lease for metal alloys, so could that be used for wind turbines? And has anyone looked at this? So maybe it might not be as bad as people say it is, because obviously we had peak oil, and then we had peak phosphorus as well, which nothing happened. Everything was available.
So we have peak everything, and now we're moving towards peak nothing. There's a gentleman there, and then we're going to, that's the last one, and we'll just wrap up.
Mickey Allen, an exploration geologist, worked in Africa most of my life. Is it not slightly patronising for the West to tell the developing countries what they should do with the money? If I was a government, I would tell them to get lost, and I'm sure people in the UK would say the same to, let's say, Brussels.
Right, that's a nice challenging note on which to finish. So why don't we go in reverse order? Tom, do you want to have your say?
Yeah, I'll just I'll pick on two of them, I think. I think it was one of the observers of the Paris Agreement said that compared to what it should have been, it was a disaster. Compared to what it might have been, it was a victory. So I think the IMDCs was a kind of messy compromise and makes it very difficult for global businesses like my members to to work out how they're going to react, because some of them are in 20 or 25 countries. The advice we've given to them is that they really are going to have to study on a country-by-country basis, but also to do the portfolio analysis with carbon pricing factored in, so that so that they can at least make sure they've got a sort of robust portfolio and that they're prepared for. I think, as I said, what I see is inevitable that sooner or later we'll have some kind of carbon pricing. What to do with the money, and is it patronising or not? Well, we never tell people what to do, but it is a very global industry. It's a very competitive industry. Companies and people who finance companies are making decisions about who to allocate capital to, and the companies are deciding where to allocate their capital. And the way the debate goes with many of the host countries is, if you want to attract capital from these global businesses, this is what you've got to do. So they can choose not to listen, they can choose to do their own thing, and sometimes they may be right. I mean, you see some countries who've actually decided that they're not going to have any mining at all. They've banned it. That's their choice, and it's it's not a perfect system. You mentioned that capitalism has all sorts of unintended consequences, but I'm not sure we've got a better system as of yet.
Dan, your last words.
I'm interested in the Paris Agreement and how it's implemented. I think maybe there's a clue to this in don't patronise people. I think that is an important point. It does mean we need to get a dialogue about which technologies can be used, where they can be used, and deal with the local governance issues. I mean, the whole of Paris depends on countries taking local actions. And I think there's a lot to be said for trying to find new mechanisms whereby sustainable technologies are going to be adopted by countries without, patronising them in one way or another. And the outcome has got to be equitable, so that the local people see that there are benefits to the way in which the economy of their area is developing. And those are the kinds of things which we haven't had to do so far, and we're going to have that kind of dialogue in future.
Thank you very much, Dan. Edmund.
I will agree with you. I mean, I think the starting point of this is the Paris Agreement. And coming back to you and where do we go from here? I think there's a discussion to be had in terms of those country plans and understanding the consequence. And now I come to wind. People are very much in favour of wind generation. And much of the debate sort of features on neodymium in terms of magnets. What's often forgotten is the tower itself and the vast amount of cement which is needed in the concrete subbase and everything else. Cement manufacture is the most polluting activity on the planet in terms of adding to CO2 emissions. So I think that there are all sorts of things that we have to recognise in helping countries implement their commitments in terms of country plans. As for being patronising, I think we also have to recognise that in certain countries, unless the results of mining add wealth in country, right, through the creation of value added in country, more countries will say no. It's a message which is persistently stated in Africa. And if I go to Ethiopia or Tanzania or Namibia, unless those countries see better benefit from mining in country, which they can then use in terms of improving health, welfare, education, they will say no. So we've got to be very careful in how we deliver some of these messages.
Okay, well I'd like to thank the three of you very much.